I'll pick up where I left off. So Esther eventually prepared a banquet to kind of help the Jews and save them and show the king Haman's plan and all that. So she became very nervous when she started to confront the king, and she kind of bounced around the bush for a little bit, like throughout the chapter. So they had like multiple days of the banquet. So after like the first day, Haman went home, again the official that did not like her cousin and didn't like the Jews at all. He saw Mordecai sitting at the king's gate once again and became furious, like overly furious. He went home and with his wife and his friends planned to actually hang him. So this story gets a little bit more crazy. So one night the king could not sleep. He gave orders to bring the book of the memorable deeds, and soon discovered that Mordecai was kind of one of the people who like set out to save him. If y'all remember, he overheard the other people trying to like set out to hurt him. So this, like, it kind of made the king like wonder, oh, who is this Mordecai guy? Like, how can I like honor him or, you know, praise him for what he did for me? And Haman was actually in the courtroom when all this was going on, and once again made him very upset. So Haman went home and, you know, was freaking out and all this. So Esther finally had worked up the courage to tell the king about Haman's plan to destroy the Jewish people. So this is back at the banquet, so the next day. So the king sought out to harm Haman, actually, now, and he was terrified and begging for his life. And eventually Haman was actually hung on the gallows that he built to hang Mordecai, which is kind of crazy. So, 180. To kind of wrap it up, the king did end up giving all of Haman's wealth to Esther and Mordecai. And he actually signed a decree to protect the Jews and keep them safe.
Wow.
So a little takeaway from this story, Esther knew that she had to save the Jews and her family despite the fact that she could have been killed, like we talked about. And Esther knew that she was a child of God and that he loved her. If she stood up for God's people, that he would back her up. So again, that's something we, as big as, you know, dying, we don't think of very often in this day and age and where we live. But there's multiple situations, whether it be us trying to witness to someone and being nervous about it or nervous what they might say. We always have to remember that God loves us and cares for us, and he's going to back us up no matter what. And she realized that what God says to us or calls us to do is more important than our fears and doubts. She put her trust in who God said she was and more than what she felt she was. So this kind of goes back to what we've talked about before with, anxiety and just being a woman of God and how to portray that. Because a lot of times we get caught up in who we think we are and, you know, how small we may think we are, but God doesn't think of us that way. So I think that's really interesting that she was able to show that and save her people and her family.
That's awesome. I really like that. Putting aside who we think we are, and other putting in our brains, like putting in the truths of who God says we are. It's right there in the first verse of Proverbs 31:10. Far more than rubies is what I always keep in my mind, and that's who Christ sees us as we are.
That definitely kind of reflects on myself too, because there's times, like, I think I've mentioned it before, but like in the youth group, sometimes I belittle myself, or like when I'm leading in the youth group, I belittle myself of like what I'm capable of doing, and who I'm capable of reaching. But in reality, like, God says all these other things about me and all the things that I'm capable of doing because of him. So I think that's really interesting.
Also, like how, like at the beginning of Esther, when he was looking for a new queen, like she didn't ask for this. Like she wasn't one of the ones who was all up in, you know, going, and like this wasn't something that necessarily she chose for herself. But yet she didn't necessarily run away from it either. Like she took God's call and said, okay, if this is where I'm at,
she knew,
let me do it to my fullest and do it to the best and follow, even if it meant losing her life.
Because she knew she was she obviously knew she was a Jew and that they didn't like them. I like that too.
Yeah, for sure.
Point.
Liv, you want to jump into...
Let's hop in.
Jump in the combo, sister.
Yeah. Let's hear about them.
So, I chose Mary and Martha, and I chose them for kind of a unique reason. There's not a lot, like their story in the Bible is not as huge. They don't have a whole book. Honestly, they only have a small section. They're only mentioned a small piece, but I think that it's a powerful story and a powerful contrast, and also it's just powerful in the way of these two women both served and both had different characteristics in their service, and we don't often recognize, like we look at one as a servant and the other one is just sitting, but as we get into it, we'll realize that they both served and they both served in different ways. So our verses, the main text, I guess, and kind of the backstory to this is in Luke 10:38-42. And so I wanted to read that because that gave good context. And then I'll dive a little more into their whole story. So it says, "Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, 'Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me.' But the Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary had chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her.'" And so this kind of brings me into the reason I chose these two women to kind of talk about and dive more into. So Mary, we often sometimes look at her and we say, okay, she was the one who was sitting at Jesus' feet, right? Like she was sitting, she was listening, she was really engaged, she was kind of in awe of Jesus and who he was, and she really kind of looked at how much power and glory he had. Yeah. But then we kind of look at the contrast of Martha, and Martha was being very hospitable. Like she was definitely bearing that characteristic of she was preparing her house and she was looking to serve and she was looking to get everything, but she was missing the treasure that was in front of her, which was Jesus. And so I found myself actually in Martha versus Mary. And so this is why I kind of chose them. So Martha, to kind of dive into, I kind of broke out some characteristics that were brought out. But Martha's characteristics were she was hospitable, but she was distracted, and she was very discontent, as we'll see in later verses. And then Mary was yearning to learn, as we see. She was at Jesus' feet. She was just there, ready, focused. She was still, and she was content in where she was at. Like she was with Jesus, and she was very content in that moment. If you move down to John, or not down, if you move a couple books over to John 12, in verses 2-8, it goes through a whole story, and I won't read the whole thing, but there was a very specific set of verses in 2 and 3, and it said, "So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair." And then we hop down a little later, and they were actually asking, like, why did she choose to do that? Why didn't she go sell it and give it to the poor? Now, Judas was the one asking that, and of course, Judas was the one who we later learned sold Jesus, so he was a thief. So in his eyes, he was like, just give more money. Yeah. But Jesus actually said in verse 7, Jesus said, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." And so I thought that also was interesting, because other people in these verses were looking on the outward, right? Looking at what we can do around us, but they were missing the treasure of Jesus. So to kind of tie it all around in my whole loop of talking, the crazy point about Martha and this and the questions I got about Mary and the ointment and what she was doing with it, or oil, was the fact that these people were missing Jesus. They were serving. They were doing as they were called. Like, as Christians, we're called to be servants. And we're called to serve, and we're called to give our most. And that's even a characteristic of one of the Proverbs 31 is, service and being selfless. As we learned with Esther, she was a very selfless person. But in all that, the relationship with Jesus was just not there.
Like, are we missing out on
Yeah.
what he's trying to tell us because we are like serving
So wrapped
so
up.
hard?
Yeah. And so I found myself in that, and I really connected because I feel like, make sure I say this right, but service is what we're called to do, and we should definitely serve, and I love serving, but sometimes I even find myself missing that relationship because I get so wrapped up in all the ministries or all the opportunities I get that I don't sit and just rest and, okay, like, Jesus, this is you, and then also sit and rest and, is this all you have for me, or am I just doing this because it's an opportunity no one else would do? And so this is kind of the contrast with Mary and Martha. So Martha was out there, she was doing everything. Like, she was the one who was ready to serve no matter what. I'll pick it up. If you won't do it, I'm going to do it. And Mary was living that treasure of Jesus and looking to build that relationship with him.
Yeah. I think that's something, sorry, before you
go ahead.
That's so amazing that all of these women did is, servant hearts are great. Like you were talking about, like, it's so great to serve, but it depends on where your heart is. Like, is your heart doing it for selfish reasons? Like, are you being selfish or are you being selfless? And just kind of really contrasting that. And I think that's something great that every single one of these women show, is that they were so selfless and they did it for the work of Christ and for God's sake rather than their own sake. I mean, I talked about it with Ruth. She could have gone and built her own family, but yet she didn't. Esther could have dropped everything and just said, oh, I don't want to be in this queen position anymore, or just kind of left, or she could have done anything, but yet she decided not to, and yet a whole entire kingdom was, a whole entire Jewish community was protected because of her sacrifice and her selflessness. And then here, Martha and Mary, we learn so much more, and Naomi, we see...
Yeah, she lost, like, everybody she loved, and she still continued to keep her eyes on Jesus.
Yeah. So I definitely think it's the heart behind it, and just making sure that as godly women, like, we keep our hearts focused on the serving of Christ instead of serving ourselves and serving others. It's all in all about Christ.
Yeah. And so Martha was one who had a lot of frustration, anxiety, and worry in her. Like, she was, I mean, as we saw, like, she literally walked up to Jesus and was like, you just let Mary sit there? Definitely paraphrase. She didn't say it that way. But that was her kind of idea. It was like, you're just letting her sit there and she's not doing anything. And so you could just see that she wasn't content. And I kind of wrote this note so I wouldn't forget how to say it. But our works are good, and our ministry and helping others is all good. And I'm not saying don't do that, because as we've learned with all these other women, serving Christ is and should be our biggest priority. But as Katie said, it's the heart behind it.
Yeah.
Because I put, it won't fill us. In fact, it leaves us more drained and empty. If you're just serving to serve, or you're serving because that's an empty spot, I gotta fill it type mindset, you're going to be empty. But only Jesus can restore and fill. Yeah. And so these women both had great characteristics. And the kind of the study that I saw in doing this was we need to pull from both of them. Because I know I often hear, like, oh, you're a Mary or you're a Martha, right? Like, we hear that. Or you'll see, like, studies where it has, you know, the two different contrasting points. But really, they both embody things that we should have. Yeah. We should strive for that relationship with Christ so that way we can serve the right way and serve him fully and serve him in the ministries and the places he has us. But like Martha, have the attitude, okay, I want to do this. Like, have that heart to want to go.
Yeah.
But we also had to slow down, let go of worry, and be still at his feet, which is what Mary did. Yeah. She just stopped being busy. She didn't worry about what was around her, and she focused on the one thing that we've learned that all these women really strived for and learned to, whether it was at the beginning of their story, in the middle of their story, at the end of their story, learn to go towards who was Christ and fix their eyes that direction. And I think that's something that we, tying back to last episode in Proverbs 31, we kind of really hit home, was that if we want to be any of these things, or we want to do any of these things, we have to have that strong relationship with Christ. It was funny, this summer we actually, you guys can hop into this because you know about this one, but we went to our youth camp and we talked about abiding, right? And that hit home for me, and I know that hit home for all of us who heard and talked about that, and even now, is taking the time is what we're talking about, and being still and really being with God.
Prioritizing,
yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we see that all these women learned or started with, was that they had to prioritize God and go for what he wanted, and that's what we have to do as well. And I think if we do that and we make him our priority, then all these other things will come into place, and all these characteristics that we've been talking about, and all these wonderful
Stresses
pieces.
And worries,
all those things will kind of fall away or be lessened, because we won't have, those won't be in the forefront. I don't remember, Ashlyn, did you say your quote from earlier that you had about if you fix your eyes on, I don't remember what that quote was now. She had a great quote that she said earlier, and but I don't remember what it was. And it's left my head.
While
actually talking about this.
something that I just thought of while we were talking about this is like keeping our eyes on Jesus and stuff. All in all, like every single one of these women like ended up with a great life, and I just think of John 10:10. It says the thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy, and so the enemy's gonna fill you with all these different things and like try to get you busy like Martha was, and try to get you just like so off focus. But at the end of the verse it says, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. And that's a quote straight from Jesus, and that's exactly what Christ wants for us, is to have an abundant life and a satisfying life, which is what Esther had, and which is what Naomi had, and Ruth had, and Mary and Martha had. Like they had such great impacts for the kingdom work, and that's exactly what Christ has for you. Like it's not all about social media, it's not all about fitting in, it's not all about this and this. It's simply a rich and satisfying life for the purpose of Christ, and with a heart for Christ, and living for him.
I also think it's important to remember that the enemy himself is also pretty powerful about getting in our heads, and also making us believe sometimes that the things we do are for good and for a certain purpose, and in reality, like in the long run or at the end of the day, like there's something that can be bad. Like we've talked about before, I think that good things, can also be bad.
Yeah.
And I
Depends
think it's
on
important.
how you use them.
Yeah, it's important to remember that, and about having the heart. It goes back to having the heart for what we're doing as well.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great point. And I had a thought on that, and it left my head. So, it's not there. But it came back. Happens. But I think, like you said, like we can do those good things, and then they end up being not good, or we look at them and we're like, that wasn't glorifying the kingdom.
Yeah.
And so something I've had to find in myself to start doing, and I think that's a key thing to think about when you go into anything, is this going to glorify the kingdom? Is this going to allow me to serve in the best way possible and to shine Christ's light? Or is it going to make me bitter and angry and just tired and not give anything that's good for Christ? And then really evaluate it that way to know, okay, is this something that's really, truly good and in God's will?
That's such another, like, big characteristic that we hit on. I was just thinking, like, of all the characteristics, and that's being wise. Like, that's using your wisdom of, okay, questioning yourself and, like, really diving into Scripture and getting Christ's wisdom rather than using your own selfish ways and stuff.
Yeah.
One thing that I've actually heard my mom talk a lot about, like, even more recently, but, like, when you go to church or when you're worshiping or whatever you're doing, trying to serve the Lord, like sometimes we talk about how, I didn't feel it this time, or I didn't I didn't get anything out of today's message church. But once again it goes back to the heart of it. Like if you go in the mindset of God is going to give me all these great things today, and he's going to tell me all these things, or even maybe it literally didn't speak to you, didn't relate to the message at all, but you have to think about it as like, how did it speak to other people?
Yeah.
Like the person right beside you could have been like completely 100% related to that.
Yeah.
And if you had just kind of been a distraction in a sense, like complaining that you did not get anything out of it, then they're not going to get anything out of it. And I think it's really easy for us to be distractions sometimes too, to people.
Me and Katie literally just had this conversation a few weeks ago because I went to a camp at Lee University the summer before my freshman year of college, and my RA stressed to us like every single night of personal study time, just because you didn't feel something in the message doesn't mean that the person next to you, like, their life could have just been changed.
And maybe it didn't relate to you now, but what if something happens 10 years from now and that message does hit home at that time, and you, like, God is going to put that message back into your head if you need to hear it then. But everything we hear from God is for a reason, whether it's for someone else or for you or for 10 years from now or whatever. So I think that's just really cool. Like, our God's awesome.
God's so good.
God's so much.
Well, through this episode, I really hope that you just, like, learned more about women of the Bible. I know they're not really...
Did.
Yeah, I did personally. So I just pray that y'all learned a little bit more about different characteristics of some women and, like,
Go
how
read
to
these
strive.
books.
Yeah, definitely go read them.
They're not long.
But we just want to kind of introduce you to some women who were a big impact throughout Scripture, and so that way you can have somebody to relate to. If you don't, like, there are people in the Bible that we can relate to and seek out wisdom from and just learn from. It's really, really cool.
XOXO Gospel Girls.